Hi, welcome to the Communitarian Podcast. The aim of such a project is to explore and examine the philosophy of communitarianism, the central premise being the emphasis of the community as opposed to the individual. Unsurprisingly, such a broad philosophy can be found to be part of the subject matter of religion, science, and politics, and much more besides. Therefore, in no particular order, I will explore such ideas. Thanks for listening, and leave your comments below. Hi, welcome to the podcast. This is part 1 of my exploration of Peter Kropotkin's ideas. It's titled Mutual Aid, Kropotkin and Darwin. What is mutual aid? The term mutual aid was helped popularized and became synonymous with Kropotkin himself. Firstly, mutual aid is a scientific concept. Kropotkin was an avid follower and contributor to science, even contributing to certain geographical discoveries himself. However, he was not the originator of such an idea, and this is where the naturalist Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882, comes in. To my surprise, within the Ethics, Kropotkin dedicates the most amount of time explaining and revering the ideas proposed by Darwin in The Origin of Species and his lesser well-known piece of work, The Descent of Man. For clarity, I have not personally read either pieces of work, therefore I'm taking Kropotkin's interpretation to be accurate and correct. The term mutual aid simply means the mutual support observed amongst animals. I was of course aware of such a behaviour, however I was completely unaware of its evolutionary significance. Kropotkin summarises the following argument made by Darwin in The Descent of Man. Quote, "The facts of mutual support within a species, which are even more important than the former, on the account of their significance for the welfare of the species and its maintenance. What is being referred to as the former is the idea of individual competitiveness." Kropotkin puts it his own way. Quote, "Solidarity has played an infinitely larger part in the development of the animal kingdom than all the adaptations which have resulted from the struggle between individuals to acquire personal advantages." After reading this, I was struck by 3 questions. How true is it? How popularly is it known? And have I missed a particular science class? Personally, I've never known the fundamental significance of the principle of mutual aid in evolution. The problem is made worse by my reluctance or prejudice to conceptualize such an idea. To me, evolution is a playbook of individuals competing against one another, not necessarily limited to combat. It is the victor of such competitions whom is likely to pass on their genetic heritage. However, both Darwin and Kropotkin state that it is the individuals who practice mutual aid which are the more likely to be victorious, therefore succeed genetically. I have decided to quote Kropotkin at length to demonstrate his case. Quote, "If mutual support is so general in nature, it is because it offers such immense advantages to all those animals which practice it, that it entirely upsets the balance of power to the disadvantage of the predatory creatures. It is the best weapon in the great struggle for life, which continually has to be carried on in nature against climate, inundation, storms, frost, and the like, and continually requires new adaptations to an ever-changing conditions of existence. Therefore, taken as a whole, nature is by no means an illustration of the triumph of physical forces, swiftness, cunning, or any other feature useful in warfare. It seems, on the contrary, that species decidedly weak, such as the ant, the bee, the pigeon, the duck, the marmot, the other rodents, the gazelle, the deer, etc., have no protective armour, no strong beak or fangs for self-defence, and are not at all warlike, nevertheless succeed best in the struggle for life, and owing to their sociability and mutual protection, they even displace much more powerfully built competitors and enemies. And finally, we can take it as proven that while the struggle for life leads indifferently to both progressive and regressive evolution, the practice of mutual aid is the agency which always leads to progressive development. It is the main factor in the progressive evolution of the animal kingdom, in the development of longevity, intelligence, and of that which we call the higher type in the chain of living creatures. No biologist has so far refuted this contention of mine." End of quote. For me, what comes to mind is the amazing spectacle performed by the emperor penguins. In order to survive the harshest Antarctic winter, the penguins huddle together for warmth. In this great huddle, they slowly rotate so that everyone benefits from the heat of others. It seems unlikely any predator could survive such temperatures by themselves. This perfectly represents the evolutionary advantage of mutual aid. What about the practice of interspecies conflict and warfare? Kropotkin clearly recognizes such an evolutionary factor, however he warns from overstating its evolutionary significance, but instead we should recognize the more prominent behavior of interspecies collaboration and mutual aid. Quote, "All the animals, beasts, birds, and fishes alike were in a continual communication, warning each other by the means of handy, perceptible signals and sounds, informing one another about all sorts of events, and thus constituting one vast community, which had its own rules of preparing the good neighbourly relations." My own prejudice against the significance of collaborative behaviour in general makes it hard for me not to be suspicious of such a claim. However, no matter how naive it may sound, it is undeniable that interspecies relations do support one another in what Kropotkin calls neighbourly relations. Mutual aid recognized as an instinct. Mutual aid relates to the social instincts more broadly. Darwin describes them, quote, "In the social instincts which lead to the animal taking pleasure in the society of its fellows, to feel a certain amount of sympathy with them, and to perform various services for them. Of course there exists other categories of instincts, selfish instincts. Again, Kropotkin points out that such a dichotomy is not between equals, as Kropotkin abbreviates. Quote, "Darwin, who knew nature, had the courage to boldly assert that there are two instincts, the social and the individual. It is the social instinct which is stronger, the more persistent, the more permanently present," and he was unquestionably right. There may be a temptation to stop such an analysis there, and claim that social instincts are simply superior in the evolutionary mechanism. However, Kropotkin and Darwin urge that it is vitally important to seek a deeper understanding and explanation of social instincts. Darwin makes the assertion that the reason why social instincts are more present is because it is accompanied with feelings of mutual sympathy. He goes on to make a very unexpected and bold assertion that this is the rudiments of moral conscience itself. To quote him directly, "Animals exhibit other qualities connected with social instincts, which in us would be called moral." I obviously knew that Darwin was a biologist, however I had no idea he made claims about morality. This is where things become really interesting, since he is arguing that morality resonates from feelings of mutual sympathy, but more controversially, he states that morality is a quality which can be exhibited by animals. Although it's not clear what Darwin's set of criteria are for considering which animals possess such qualities, he gives examples of dogs and elephants. However, to be clear, he's not arguing that such animals have a conscious understanding of their own moral principles. Instead, he is pointing out that if an animal has social instincts, it is likely to have feelings of empathy to its own kind. This behavior can be observed in many different species of animals. Kropotkin builds on this observation, arguing that these feelings of sympathy can spark acts of self-sacrifice, describing them as, quote, "zoological fact of everyday occurrence in nature." To be clear, such acts of self-sacrifice are not just acts of mutual benefit, since in certain instances, acts of self-sacrifice can jeopardize the survival of the individual. Kropotkin reiterates that such actions possess, quote, "the origin of moral sentiment, man's origins and moral life." How is it that human beings fit into all of this? Of course, Darwin's intellectual and scientific originality could and would not be restricted to non-human animals. The key revelation of Darwin's Origin of Species was that man is as much part of nature as any other animal. Therefore, the claim being made is that we too are motivated by our social instincts. To test and explore such an idea, Kropotkin prioritizes the need to study the history of man, anthropology. Where to start with man? Kropotkin argues that we must start by studying the tribal mode of life amongst those of our early post-glacial period, 12,800 years ago to 11,500 years ago. However, there is a problem. There is neither the physical data nor the written historical records to conduct such an investigation. The only alternative is to study those tribes which exist today that closely resemble that era. It is worth noting that for the majority of human history, we lived in such a tribal lifestyle. There is a slight problem with scientific validity with such an analysis, since we cannot conclusively say that such tribes resemble the post-glacial ancestors. However, there is good evidence that such tribes have existed relatively untouched by modern civilization. Therefore, I don't find it too problematic to follow Kropotkin's inquiry to its scientific ends. By undergoing such a study, Kropotkin concludes, quote, "Wherever they are studied, the observer always finds the same sociable tendencies, the same social spirit, the same readiness to curb the willfulness for the sake of supporting the social life." There shouldn't really be anything surprising about this, since as a social animal we exhibit the same social instincts. Therefore the behaviour of mutual aid amongst animals in general is, quote, "the same principle confirmed by the history of mankind." To support such a claim, Kropotkin identifies the relative key features of tribal life. Tribal identity. The primary observable quality of tribal life is the powerful identification of the individual to the tribe as a whole. Quote, "Social life, that is, we, not I, is the normal form of life. It is life itself. Here, in that identification, or what we might even say, in this absorption of the I by the clan or tribe." Quote, "The self-assertion of personality came much later on. Even now, the psychology of lower savages scarcely knows any individual or personality. The dominant concept in their minds is the tribe." It is easy to understand why in the modern political climate, tribal identity is understood as shorthand for blind allegiance. There is some truth to making such a correlation. However, it is important to understand such a term from the technical point of view of the tribe's members themselves. For them, without protection from the tribe, each individual is insignificant compared to the threat imposed by the Goliath and mortal forces of nature. It is clear that such an identification runs deeper than sharing a dress code or cultural heritage. It really underpins what it is to be a member of a tribe. It also sheds light on their possible relationship to nature. In fact, it would be wrong to assume that such tribes feared or even hated the natural world in which they lived. Within his work, Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution, Kropotkin explains that such a relationship was based more in reverence and curiosity. Quote, "Genuinely speaking, for the primitive savage, animals are mysterious, enigmatic beings possessing of a wide knowledge of the things of nature." Kropotkin goes on to make some interesting and in some instances outlandish claims about how symbiotic such a relationship was. For instance, he makes an interesting point about how tribes relate to other social and solitary animals. Quote, "To the primitive man, isolated life seems so strange, so much out of the usual course of nature, that when he sees a tiger, a badger, a shrew mouse leading a solitary existence, or even when he notices a tree that stands alone far from the forest, he creates a legend to explain such a strange occurrence. He makes no such legends to explain life in societies, but he has one for every case of solitude." Kropotkin advocates that our tribal ancestors would have practiced mutual aid beyond the confines of the tribe and would have extended it to include their animal counterparts. Indeed, many hobbies today can only be explained by a desire to see other animal species flourish. Of course, our tribal ancestors hunted. However, it is well documented the sincere respect tribes have for the hunted animal, which is encapsulated in their ceremonies. Personally, I believe Kropotkin overstretched himself when he claimed that our ancestors learnt important psychological lessons and moral teachings from their observations of the animal kingdom. For instance, he talks about the great lesson of fearing retribution, which was learnt from living in close proximity to predators which could kill humans. It is true that tribes have been found which idolize and mythologize animals like crocodiles. However, it's not clear that retribution in general was learnt from our relationship to animals. Another point he makes, which I don't think needs criticizing, is, quote, "They notice the importance of clan or tribe, the observation of one general rule, never kill one another." Regardless, the important point being made is the existence of a powerful identification of the individual to the tribe as a whole, tribal identity, and human progression. Kropotkin boldly announces that the, quote, "identification of the unit with the whole lies the origin of all ethics, the germ out of which all subsequent concepts of justice and the still higher concepts of morality evolved." How else could morality ever come into fruition? It requires a social animal which has the capacity to supersede instincts of self-preservation. It is important to reiterate that such a capacity allows for an animal to have a greater evolutionary advantage. Kropotkin makes the point that if instincts of self-preservation dominate tribal life, the tribe, quote, "necessarily begins to fail in the struggle for life. It moves towards its decay." Not wishing to jump the gun, this prompts an interesting question. What happens if self-preserving instincts dominate our lives, however, we as a species do not fail in the struggle for life? Are we currently in a process of decay without dying? What could be the symptoms of not exercising our once necessary social instincts? Putting such questions to one side, it is clear that our social instincts have allowed for a footing of human progress. For instance, the development of speech, memory, and intelligence. To identify with others requires and requests the development of such capacities. Such advancements have led to the development of a greater emotional intelligence, in particular the capacity for sympathy, without which our capacity to consider the opinions of others or that of the public would be undermined. Over the course of our evolution, this mutual sympathy has grown stronger and has finally developed into something truly unique only amongst human beings, a sophisticated moral sense or conscience. Quote, "the starting point of all higher ethical feelings." The development of a moral sense not only encourages mutually beneficial behavior, but also has crucially led to the galvanization of self-sacrifice as the key cornerstone of morality. It is those actions which are inspired by benevolence and which are performed with no expectation of anything in return. As Kropotkin explains, quote, "those unselfish feelings and habits, usually called by the somewhat inaccurate names of altruism and self-sacrifice, alone deserve, in my opinion, the name of morality." The manifestation of justice. These higher ethical feelings have coincided with the development of concepts and ideals which can be understood rationally. Kropotkin notes, quote, "in proportion as mutual aid becomes an established custom within a human community, and, so to say, instinctively, it leads to the parallel development of a sense of justice, with its necessary accompaniment of a sense of equity and egalitarian self-restraint. This sense of justice is not a uniquely human occurrence, and can be observed in other animals to a lesser degrees. For example, mothers feeding their suckling offspring, or play fighting amongst cubs. It is within the tribe that such a concept of justice reaches its full potency. Kropotkin identifies that within this setting, the concept of justice closely resembles what we would consider equality. As a result, there is a strong tendency to practice egalitarianism. The Patagonian people practice the most striking example of this, as was observed by Darwin and others, including David Attenborough in our times. Darwin himself observed that how food was equally distributed amongst all presents, no matter its size. Astonishingly, this was even practiced when only each participant would receive a crumb. Kropotkin explains that such an occurrence is not an oddity, but the norm. Quote, "The nearer the primitive society is to the most ancient forms, the more strictly is the rule, everyone for all observed." Tribal culture. The Patagonian example given also demonstrates the sophisticated development of shared tribal ideals and culture. This then manifests itself into codes of conduct and degrees of law. Kropotkin gives a very telling example depicting the strength of such a tribal culture, given by the missionary and social historian called Innokinti Venyaimov. Venyaimov spent a considerable amount of time living with the Aleuts of North Alaska. He talks of an incident when embarking on a voyage to leave the Aleuts, to which he was going to return back in 6 months' time. He forgot to pack a bundle of dried fish which had been given to him as a present by the tribe. On his return he had learnt that the tribe had lived through a period of utter famine. Unbelievably, in all that time they never touched the dry fish. The intriguing question is what motivated the tribe members to behave in such a way. It's intriguing how their instincts of self-preservation were suppressed by a greater force. We mustn't be too quick to assume that such actions were solely motivated by the eagerness to simply follow rules, since the impartial practice of rules is no match against the real needs of self-preservation. Kropotkin carefully considers the nuance behind such law-abiding behaviour. He argues that tribal customs have two inherent objectives. On one hand, to promote the social instincts by solidifying the progressive development made by mutual aid, moral feelings and justice. On the other hand, it also deters selfish instincts by denouncing actions which seek to exploit and dominate others for personal gain. As an example, he again references the Aleuts tribal society. Like many other tribal societies, their customs can be broadly divided into two categories. The first of these rules dictates the everyday customs of tribal life, for example, being the first to waken in a long voyage, to show greed when dividing spoils, bragging over one's deeds, how disputes are settled, etc. All such rules are set as desirable codes of conduct, which if not followed are punished with ridicule and shame by the rest of the tribe. The second of these rules dictate the more fundamental standards of tribal life, for instance, how murder is dealt with within the tribe, respecting tribal spirituality, etc. To disobey any of these stricter rules is very uncommon and would probably result in being banished from the tribe. There is one last element which is common in tribal life, and that is religion. Religious rituals and superstitions give any particular tribal custom a spiritual prominence. Its origin is to promote self-restraint for the sake of the rest of the tribe. This is why such tribal religions tend to be based on ramifications of a powerful force of nature or the spirits of dead ancestors. Put simply, to ignore tribal customs puts the whole tribe at physical and spiritual risk. The mantra being, if you act like that, the whole tribe will be spiritually punished. This is an immensely powerful way to reinforce the tribal way of life. Surprisingly, Kropotkin speaks positively when he states the fundamental importance of such a development. Quote, with the appearance of religion, even in its crudest form, human ethics was enriched by a new element, which gave to that ethics a certain stability and later contributed to its inspiration and a new measure of idealism. It's interesting that he uses the words gave to ethics a certain stability. However, wouldn't it be fair to question whether such a depiction of tribal life really indicates a type of moral relativism? Since isn't it relative what rules or codes of conduct each tribe draw up? It's first important to point out that Kropotkin is not claiming that each tribal society has the same rules governing customs, nor that every custom is equally valid. However, his point is that tribal societies share a certain commonality, that is, what is useful or harmful to the preservation of the tribe is understood to be good or evil for the tribe as a whole and not the individual. This is how human morality has manifested itself, and it explains why the greatest ethical teachers agree on basic commonalities, such as, do to others what you would have them do to you in the same circumstances. Therefore, Kropotkin's examination of the origin of morality is not relative, but instead, in fact, objective in character. He argues that it is instead possible to judge and rank each sort of tribal society based on its ethical criteria. This concludes the end of part 1. The next part is titled Kropotkin asks, why don't we take such evidence seriously? Thanks for listening, and subscribe if you've enjoyed.